Okay, guys, my name is Islan Alawala. I am working as a Salesforce Techno Functions consultant at Tectonic, and I've been in the Salesforce industry since last almost 4.5 years, and have so far the journey has been incredible. As you all know, the Salesforce has been amazing and is providing us with a lot of different things. And secondly, I would also like to thank Park Dreamin because it's the first time the event for the Pakistan community, and thank you for everybody who's participating in this event. So now I'll go to my session, which is the topic of the session is Apex Trigger for admins and business analysts. So just before I start, I would like to say, that the reason that I chose this topic is because I feel that admins have great knowledge about out-of-the-box automation, but when it comes to triggers, they do know it is an automation, but they are not sure how it actually works and how to write it. If you're an admin who is aware of, let's say flows, then I think understanding triggers would get a bit easier since you do use things like, variable loops, etc. in the flows. So this would definitely give you an edge. Just give me a second, sorry guys. Apologies for that. So, okay, so now we'll move forward to the table of contents. So we'll be covering trigger overview. So the next is we'll be finding out the reasons, or basically, we'll find out when to consider writing a trigger. Then the order of execution, why it is important when it comes to triggers. Then there's a development path, and by development path, there are certain ways you can write a trigger. And then, of course, there is an example trigger. And then, of course, if you have any questions. So we really need, so the thing is, the question I think you guys should ask you, why are you guys here? Maybe you're here for the reason that you want to know what is this trigger doing in my org. So if you work with a lot of developers and other people in your org and you see triggers, right? It's kind of like a mystery thing within the org that you may not be aware of. Maybe you're working on a project and when something goes wrong and you have to check your workflow, processes, and flows, but somewhere at the back of your mind, you're like, maybe it's the trigger who's the culprit in this case. Or maybe you just want to write your own triggers moving forward, or you want to learn or at least be able to read the code that is already written by developers in the org, in your org. So, and it's always fascinating, to be very honest with you, when you're working with a group of developers, if you can talk in their language. So once you get the basic idea of the triggers, you will probably be able to talk in their language, and it's kind of cool, to be very honest. So moving forward to what are Apex triggers? So triggers are basically like workflows, process builders, flows, only created via code and hence more flexible. So it means basically triggers are more flexible because we can, we write them programmatically. It's basically, you can think of trigger as a file that contains some code. As per the best practices, it is always recommended to have one trigger per object. Triggers are basically waiting for database events to happen so that they can run and do the magic. And database events, I'm pretty sure a lot of admins, or even if you're a BA, you have loaded multiple data into, let's say, into an account object or an opportunity object, and you've seen insert, upsert. I'm sure you are familiar with insert, update, the upsert kind of commands that are part of the, when you're uploading data using download. So these are basically, I would say, the events that basically executes the trigger at the back end. So anytime a DML is done, trigger will fire. It's like whenever you insert, I'll give you an example. Let's say whenever you inserted a lead record trigger, whenever you inserted a lead record, and there is a trigger on the lead object, so trigger will basically wait for that record to either be inserted or updated or upsetted depending on the events that are part of the trigger. And then the trigger will do its magic on that piece of information. So as you can see on the left hand side of this slide, there is a great visual representation that I got from Karen Jemisin's presentation. It's basically, whatever changes you make to the org, trigger waits and listens to that piece of information. When that information, something happens to that record in the org, trigger basically sends out a message, applies that piece of code to that record, and something happens. So let's say if I'm updating, so the example would be, whenever I'm creating any of the account, I want, the Park Dream 2021 to be appended in the name. So what the trigger will do is it'll basically wait for the record. Whenever a record is inserted, let's say I'm, I'm right, the account name is XYZ, and when I hit save, when the page refreshes, the trigger will do its work at the back end, and you'll see XYZ argument. So this is like uh, one of the examples of the triggers where it works, how it works at the back end. There are certain use cases for triggers that could be, you can use triggers to compare before and after a change is made to a record, maybe create or update new related records. So maybe, you want to do something, let's say you inserted an account and you wanted certain, let's say 5 contacts related records to be created. So you can use triggers in that case. Um, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Scrum, but they say in Scrum, the sprint is basically the heartbeat of the Scrum. So, in my opinion, the before and after triggers are like the heartbeat of the trigger. And before, and as I previously mentioned, you always write one trigger per object. So basically, before and after triggers, you can think of it in a way that there are different sections in one trigger. So there's a before section, there's an after section. So basically, with before triggers, when to use before triggers, it's very important to understand when to use before triggers and when to use after triggers. So with before triggers, you can work with data programmatically and change that data before it is saved into database. Let's say you want to do some validation check, and let's say yes, there are sales reps that are putting data in account object, and sales rep most of the times, not really most of the time, but at times they put in junk data, and you don't want that to happen. So you can use before triggers to do some validation checks. But keeping in mind, always keep in mind that if something can be done, or if you can do a validation check using validation rules, you have to always go for that first. Triggers validation checks are required or needed to be done whether when it involves complex validations to make sure that the data that is being inserted by a sales rep is not junk and it does not mess anything up. So basically, once the data is saved into the database, it's saved. Once the data is saved, then you can do quite a few things. And but in that case, what you'll do is you'll go for after trigger. So let's say in the case of an account, the example that I give, once we inserted an account, we want 5 related contacts to be created. So, once that account record is created, we want, multiple contacts to be created, 5 or 10, whatever is the use case for you guys. So in that case, we'll use after triggers. And in the next slide, I have a great, yes, this is a great slide, great visual representation of the before and after triggers. So I'll give you a scenario. So imagine you made a change to a lead record, and on a lead object, there's a trigger. Let's say that trigger is basically waiting for a lead record to be inserted. In the trigger, there will be a section before save. And in that section, you would be like, I want to do the following things to the record that is being inserted. So that's basically this part, before trigger. That's you're doing some checking. You're validating the data that is being coming. Second, so it will do such validate compare. Maybe you want to do you want to do validation. You want to maybe do some compare the values and the other stuff. So after all these actions are done, it's this would be saved into database. And once it's saved, then the after part is fired. So basically, in after parts, you can create related records, and you can create related records in after part because the record ID is generated. If you're inserting an account, let's say in before triggers, you won't get an ID. In after triggers, you'll get an ID. So when you have to attach or maybe relate the context to an account, you definitely need an ID. So in that case, after triggers are case to go. So again, this is a great. So before going with the approach of writing a trigger, I think this is something that we really need to consider. So the first and the foremost thing is the development really needed? So if it's not, of course, you can say no. How to out of the box automation. So if the development is really needed, Yes, maybe. If you go, can it be built declaratively? Again, yes, you can build declaratively. And I mean, 2 years ago, or I would say in 2018, a lot of work or a lot of complex automations was done using Trigger. But since in the last 2 years, Salesforce has done tremendous job of improving the flows. So I think almost everything can be done using flows. But having said that, when a declarative solution, I mean, you can solve the problem declaratively, but if the problem is complex, then I would suggest to go with a trigger because managing a trigger or debugging a trigger is ideal as compared to debugging the flow or any other website automation. And once you've done that, once you've built the trigger, you can you can deploy to production. But again, you cannot deploy the triggers to production directly. So we'll talk about it in the later part of it. So order of execution. So it's very important when we talk about triggers. So this slide consists of like some brief steps of the order of execution. We have, I think, 14 or 15 steps as part of the order for execution. I have also shared the link at the top of the slide. So I don't know how many of you remember in math classes where you used to solve a problem using the order of operation in math. In math, order of operation was really important. So let's say if I say, parenthesis open, 2 plus 2, parenthesis close, and multiply by 3, what it'll give you? It'll give you 12, right? So this is exactly what applies to Salesforce. And Salesforce has a very specific order of how it does things. And this is like a short list. You can find a complete list either in Outbox or by using the link I posted about, as mentioned before as well. First, we have before triggers, then we have duplicate rules, then after triggers, and then assignment rules, and the workflow rule, and then field updates. And once, if there is a field update due to the workflow or any other processes, before and after triggers are executed again. And if you're not aware of the ordering, you can mess it up. And I was just to let you know, let's say, if you're not aware of the order of execution and you think that, the assignment rules will be executed first. So you may go ahead and write a trigger that, okay, I'll write a trigger, let's say assignment rule will assign this record to a particular sales rep, and then I can do certain changes on the basis of that sales rep. So that won't happen. So that's why it's very important you know, to know the order of execution and to keep that at the back of your mind when you're writing a trigger. That when before triggers are fired, when after triggers are fired. Okay, so this is again where our Apex trigger written in Salesforce. That's one thing. So basically, when we talk about the automation, out of box automation like process builder workflows, you can write in any of the orgs. You can directly configure them in production. Even though it's not recommended, but you can do it. With triggers, that is not the case. You cannot directly write a trigger in production. For that, you either need a sandbox or you can do it one of the developer editions orgs. So that's one thing you have to keep in mind when you're writing a trigger. You cannot directly write the triggers in production, and that does make sense because it's a programming. You write a trigger programmatically, and you have to test it before you move it to. Because if you don't test it, it can cause havoc in your own. Okay, so development paths when we are writing triggers. So the first one is to put all the work in the trigger, and the second one is to put all the work in a handler class. And why? And I'm sure, as you can see, there's a red pill and the blue pill. And I'm sure all of you have seen Matrix where they have the option of a red pill. So putting all the work in the trigger is like a red pill. It's a common practice, but not so good practice, I would say, to put all the code in the trigger cell. One trigger per object, and you have all the stuff in that. Does all the things, and it's easier to do it, right? I mean, you can put all the work in one trigger. It's easier to do it, but why won't you do it? It is because once the trigger gets complex, it's very difficult to manage it. It's not really readable. Even if you have comments in the code, it's not easy to read. So that's one thing. For option two, in Salesforce, when we say put all the work into a handler class, basically we have one trigger that is basically calling multiple handler classes. So Salesforce, one of the widely recognized best practices is to make trigger logicless. And by logicless is mean you implement all the functionality of the trigger in the handler class. That is to keep the trigger free from business logic and put the logic into trigger handler or a helper class. This means that the role of the trigger is only to delegate the responsibilities to some other handler class. So basically, trigger is executing and transferring the information to the handler or helper class. So there's another visual presentation for a helper class. So basically, triggers are basically like process builders, And helper classes are like process builders nodes, which helper classes, the benefit of helper classes is first of all they are really easy to understand, and of course they can you can reuse. So that's some of the things you can do. Um, okay, now moving forward to, so we had two scenario. So I have a, for the first scenario is that we are updating a company name. Whenever a user inputs a company name on a lead object as Spark space Dreaming, then basically we have a trigger that basically updates to Spark Dreaming 2021 on a lead object. So we'll look into it. And for the first trigger, I have gone with the option one. And yes, one more thing. I would advise all the newbies that are working on that do plan on working on a trigger or will write their first trigger. My advice would be to go with option one first. Once you learn on how to write a trigger, then you can of course go with option two. And whenever you're working in a client org, option two is always advisable to implement. But I feel like option one is easier for a newbie to get into triggers and stuff like that. So yeah. Okay, so the first problem scenario is updating the company name, and I've gone with option one. So in the next one, I have. Oh yeah, before that, how to write your first trigger. So basically, how do you write your first trigger? It's very important. So you can write the trigger by going to your developer console. Um, from the you'll see the wrench on the top right of your org once you log in. Open the developer or go to new, you'll see these things, Apex trigger, and you'll write, you'll select the S objects. And just one more thing. So whenever you're writing workflow process builder, you define a project. Let's say you're defining, I want to update something on an account. So you define the object account. That is the same case with triggers. You have to define the object. So so basically this is the object. I want the trigger to work on a lead object, and this is my trigger name. And again, we always try to keep our trigger name. In my case, my trigger name is lead trigger example, but if I was working for maybe one of my customers, I would have preferred to go with the lead trigger, only lead trigger, no example, nothing. It has to be lead triggers, and then we can call multiple handlers. And we try to keep our code readable in a way that anybody who opens up the trigger or the classes, they do understand that what that particular piece of class would do, or that what particular piece of method that would do. So that's how you write the first trigger. Now moving forward, this is a syntax of the trigger. So basically, first it's trigger. You write trigger, and then there's the name of the trigger that you're writing, and then on again a keyword, right? Lead. Any of the object could be lead, it could be account, it could be opportunity, it could be opportunity line items, and then there is event. Before insert, before update, after insert, after update, and then you perform your the logic in in between the brackets here. So I'll go down to the next slide. So this is the first trigger. So basically, what is I'm doing the same thing. It's trigger, the lead trigger example. Lead trigger example is the name of my trigger, and it's going to work only on before inserted, before update. So what is doing? So what is basically doing is when you open the brackets, in this bracket, I'm writing for lead L trigger.new. Basically, trigger, you can think of trigger.new as like a bucket of records that will be incoming. So it could be one record, it could be 10 records. So think of that like trigger.new as a bucket with records. And lead L is basically I am naming whatever record that is coming to me, I'm naming it L for them. Now, once that happens, I open another bracket and I go in there. I see that the record L record that's coming in, there is two equals. Now we are basically comparing the company name. That so basically whichever record that is coming into, uh, you know, whichever record that is being inserted into the system, we are checking if the company name is equal. I mean, we're comparing if the company name is Park Space Dreaming. If that is the case, then what you do is you basically assign this Park Dreaming Space 2021 to the company name. If that does not match, nothing will happen. Let's say if I've written Pakistan Dreaming or maybe something else or maybe Dreaming, nothing would have happened. But since I've written Park Space Dreaming, so basically if the company name matches on the record that is incoming, then this will be updated. So, and then you close the trigger, and that's about it. You've done your first trigger. It's pretty simple to write triggers. So this is one of the basics version of this is like one of the basic triggers that I've written. Of course, you will see triggers that are absolutely intensely complex. It contains 500, 600 lines of the classes are huge. So once you get hold of it, you will eventually get used to it, and you'll know what actually everything is to happen. Now we go to, so basically how to deploy your trigger. So in case of workflow or process building or flows, you just directly create a change set and you to push the changes to a production route. It's simple, right? But when you're deploying any of the programming, like you're deploying triggers or any of the classes, you need a test class. And in order for a trigger to deploy, the test class needs to have the 75% coverage, and that is the minimum coverage. It's recommended to get 100%, but 75 is the minimum that you need. And now I'll let you know what this basically test class does. It's So as you can see, the first of all, I have declared at is test. So basically, this is a class. Again, you can create a class by instead of writing Apex trigger, I would have gone to Apex class. I would have directly created a class. It is advisable. It is highly advisable that you just append test at the end of the, like for example, if I'm writing a test class for my lead trigger examples, so I will append test at the end. So so that like maybe down the line after 4 or 5 months, if I have to see something, what's going on in test class, or if I made any changes to my triggers, and now if you update the test class, it's easier to find. So if I would have named this class, let's say lead it's test, it would have been difficult to that this test class is connected to that trigger. So it's always advisable to name it in a way that you can relate to which trigger or which class it's working for. So at this test, at the top of the test class is basically telling Salesforce that it is a test class. Secondly, you see that there is a variable called private. So I mean, I would explain public to you. So we have two variables, private and public. So I would explain public to you, and the opposite of public is private. So you get, and I think explaining public is easier. So public keyword is like any code that is within your OR that can reach, I mean, within my OR can reach into this class and look at it. So basically, any other code that is within your OR can look at the contents of this class. So that is public. Whereas with private, that is not the case. Now, there's a class keyword and there's a class name. Now I'll go to static. I think we shall leave static for now. We go to test method. Test method is the name of my, the method that I'm creating. Void means that this test class is not returning anything, and it's a lead. And I have again, so now basically in test class, once you have written a trigger and you test it on the UI, like you would have gone to the lead object, and you create a lead record, and you would have seen the path driven would have been updated to path driven 2021. So here it's exactly what we're doing, but we are just adding a unit test to make sure that whatever the purpose the trigger is written for is being served. So here we are creating one record, and I'm filling in the details. So basically, I've created a lead L. Again, L is basically, you could say, the record that I'm going to insert in the lead object. L dot first name, that the first name of the L record has to be Islam. The L dot last name has to be Allah. L dot company has to be Park Space Dreaming, and L dot status is equal to new. Once I insert L in here, you can see. So what will happen is basically that the trigger will fire. So the company name will automatically be updated at the back end, right? So now next, I'm again doing a software query. So I've written the object lead, and I've written lead. You can write lead 1, lead 2, whatever. It's up to you. And I'm fetching the first name company from lead, where first name is equal to Islam. And now I'm using system asserts equal. This is very important to use system asserts when you're writing a test class. It's basically it's considered one of the best practices when you're writing test classes. And system assert equals what it basically does is basically I've given the lead dot company. So basically, whatever the company name is coming up from the query, it should be equal to this. If it's this, it'll give me true. So that's the case. And since I inserted Park Space Dreaming, but when I inserted my record, the trigger fired at the back end. So basically, it updated the Park Space Dreaming to Park Dreaming 2021. Okay, that's done. Now I updated again. Like I updated the same record. I updated the this section, this part of the test class covers the insert part. I mean, I can still run the test coverage, and I'll get maybe somewhere around 70 or 80%. So because you remember we wrote trigger for before insert and before update. So now we have to test the update part as well. We can't just leave it at the insert part. So now what I'm doing is I'm again, I'm updating the company name to Park Dreaming and updating L. So when I update L, it will the trigger the before update will fire again. And again, I'm fetching the query and I'm checking for the assert condition, whether the update command, updated it or not. Okay, now I'll go to the. So this is the another trigger. So this is the second trigger. I'll just go to the scenario quickly. So it's like update billing address with shipping address on an account whenever the two addresses are different. So basically, this is considered one of the, in this, I would show you how to write a handler class for an account trigger. So basically, the first few things are exactly the same: trigger, on account, and I'm just using it before insert. This condition, as you can see, trigger is before. Basically, it's giving you, these are called context variables, and these are also very important to know. Basically, so in this case, you can find the list of context variables in the help document provided by Salesforce. But this trigger dot is before and is insert will return true when the trigger is firing before insert. If I have written, let's say, is after, then this would have returned false and this would have returned true. So this condition would have not worked because we don't have an after insert condition. So basically, these are variables that returns true, and you can play around with these to check. Like, let's say if you had like before insert and after insert condition here, and you only want this piece of code to fire on a before insert condition. So basically, we do this: trigger is before, yes, it's working as before, and then trigger is insert, yes, it's working as insert. Then only this will go into this. So this is the name of my handler class, which is account trigger handler, and in that class, we're looking at create accounts section of the code. I would say the methods of the code. And in that method, we are passing the trigger.new. Again, the bucket of the records that we will get. It could be one, it could be multiple. So now I'll go to my class. It's a public class, like I explained it before. The public class is, any piece of the code can see it. And this is a static void create account. This is the name of the method which I passed here, create account, and all the items that will be part of the trigger will be passed here. And then what I'm doing is I'm looking at each of the records that is coming. And in this case, in previous case, it was the records that were incoming. We named them as L. In this case, we have named as ACC. You can name it as an account. You can name it then as A. Just, it's up to you. And so in this case, what I'm doing, whenever a record is coming, we're checking if the shipping state is not equal to billing state. So you see that exclamation and equals to, that means not equal. So we're seeing if the shipping state is not equal to billing state, then the billing state value needs to be assigned to the shipping state. So that's how we are doing in this case. So these are two basic triggers that we've written. Of course, like I mentioned before, the triggers can be really complex. If you're looking for clients that are top clients, you'll see triggers that are tremendously complex. So it's easier to get overwhelmed. If you open them up, you'll be like, oh my god, what is this going on? So I prefer, if you plan on writing with trigger, start easy, start writing small codes, go with an option one first, and then gradually build on that. Okay. So there are certain trigger best practices. So as mentioned before, one trigger per object is the best practices. You may see in some orgs that they have multiple triggers, but then again, that's not a best practice because you are not aware when each of the triggers will fire. So it's always advisable to have one trigger per object, and then you can, and if you implement your trigger using option 2 approach, which is trigger and calling out a handler classes, then you will avoid hitting governor limits. So the next is bulkify your code. Now, what is bulkification? That's a word that you may have heard about from the developer. So bulkify Apex would ensure that the code that you're running is able to effectively handle more than a single record at once. So basically, when a collection record initiates Apex, a single instance of that code is executed. Right? So basically, that's the case with bulkification. You are able to handle multiple records. If your code is not bulkified, and if you're, let's say, to give you an example, I'll just go to avoid sortal queries inside for loops. If you're writing, in the for loops, you're writing a sortal query, and in the Salesforce, we have a limit of not more than 100,000 queries in a transactions, and not more than 150 DML. So if you have a socket query in a for loop, and if your for loop is running, let's say 150 times, you'll hit governor limits. Your trigger will not work. So you have to keep these things in mind. And using collections of efficient and streamlined queries. And like I mentioned before, guys, that you guys, if you have used flows, that you're aware of list loops and stuff like that. In the Salesforce, when we talk about the Apex, we have three kind of collections. I'll just do rename them. I'm not going to be explaining that because you might get overwhelmed. So we have list, set, and maps. So we have these three things, and mostly, we work using these three: list, set, map. Avoid hard coding of IDs. Why do we avoid hard coding of ID? Let's say I have a trigger that works on a record type, which has an ID of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in one of our sandboxes, right? And now when I move my trigger to production, that the same record type ID is different. So let's say the ID of, let's say the record type name is business accounts, and the record type ID in sandbox is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the same record type business account has an ID of 98876 5. Right. So when you will push your trigger to production, your trigger will not work. It'll search for record type with ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It will not get it, so it will not work. So that's why avoid hard coding of ID. It says put the code that has all the things in the class, and then point the trigger to the code in the class. And as mentioned before, handler, easy to understand, easy to maintain. Don't save record one by one. That's one more thing. When you are iterating over multiple records, it's important to store your records in a list. And once everything is stored in a list, then apply the DML. Then apply the DML outside of the loop. And it's always preferred, like I mentioned before, do not do the socket, do not apply the DML within the loop, or else you hit covered limits. So I think that's about it. Thank you, everybody. I'll hand it over to the moderator. I'll see my window if I have any questions for me. If you have any questions for me.
Thank you, Sran. It was a great session.